We started this church 12 years ago, and when we did, it was one of the foundational ideas we wanted to lay down. Right? When we were in that living room and saying, let's do this, one of the foundational ideas of what we were trying to lay down is how big God is. How big God is. Like when we surveyed the church landscape in Fort Worth 12 years ago, what we realized is that we don't need another church service. There's hundreds of church services going on right now in Fort Worth, and good chance you're gonna go to one of those next week, okay? After the whole money thing and then, Jezebel, right? So we were like, we don't need another church service in Fort Worth, but what we saw as a need was that what Fort Worth needed was a huge God. They needed to see how big Jesus was, the bigness of God, the glory of God, the gravity and gladness of following Jesus, who has burnished bronzed feet and eyes that are like flames of fire. And so check this, this is just maybe possible for you, that your Jesus is too small. That the way in which you think about Jesus, the way in which you've thought about Jesus is actually too small. And by the way, I don't think that's your fault. I think that's actually our fault. I think that's pastors and preachers and teachers. It's the church institution. I think it's actually our fault because we've been perfectly, in the American church, we've been perfectly satisfied with your twice a month attendance to church and your tithe check. Right? We've been too comfortable with just that, and we haven't told you about a huge God. Right, a God with big glory and big grace, and we've just given you a little Jesus that can maybe help you in your relationships and help you along with the rest of your life, the things you really want to pursue. This Jesus can help you, and that's what we've given you, and we haven't told you that he's huge. But the image today that we have in Revelation, and the imagery in Revelation is the book of Revelation. That's why it's such a powerful book, is the pictures. It's meant to be visceral. It's meant to make you feel something. If you're a little bit offended by some of the picture that we read today, that we're seeing today, it's meant to do that in you, to stir something in you. And one of the things that this picture is meant to do is to show you how big Jesus is. Right? His feet are like burnished bronze, meaning he stands firm as king. And his kingdom will never end. His eyes are like a flame of fire. They're pure and they're purifying, and you can't escape them, and you shouldn't want to. But it's a huge Jesus that we look at. And we're gonna take a look at a church that he's writing to whose view of Jesus is just too small. They have compartmentalized their faith. Their faith is sectioned off from the rest of their life. They've got their faith, but then they've got the rest of their life over here. Jesus isn't central for them. He isn't big enough in their lives, and so it leads to compromise. A compartmentalized Jesus leads to a compromised faith, and Jesus is gonna write to them and he's gonna tell them, hey, I'm so much bigger than that. And I have so much more for you. So much more, my promises are so much greater than what the world can offer you. And so last week, if you weren't here, we had this thing we just called an interlude, where we just wanted to tune our ears to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Let him who has ears to hear, let him hear. And it was just this powerful and sweet Sunday last week. But then if you remember 2 weeks ago, if you were here, we looked at Jesus writing to another letter to another church, and we said they were beginning to flirt with some ideas. That some folks were beginning to hear some things, believe some false teaching, and they were beginning to flirt with that kind of idea. And then this week, we're gonna find out that now this church is actually in bed with those ideas. Literally, they're in bed with those ideas, and if we're not careful, we'll end up like the church next week that is spiritually dead. That's the progression, the trajectory of every church or every Christian that does not hear Jesus's gracious warnings. Okay, that's what's happening. That's what he's beginning to talk about. And so this is a gracious warning for Jesus, but listen, I have so much hope for us today. Like I think what the Lord did last week was meant to prepare our hearts for this week and for next week as well, that our hearts would be softened. We would have an experience of God, like a tangible presence of God, that our hearts might be softened to hear hard things and to let go of some things that maybe we don't want to let go of. So I have a lot of grace, hope for us today in God's grace for us, okay? Now, he's writing this letter to the church in Thyatira. Thyatira was the smallest and least influential of the 7 cities. It was a blue-collar town. It was known for its manufacturing. Just produced a lot of different goods and services. The Apostle Paul, he planted a church in Philippi, and he started with a gal named Lydia, who was actually from Thyatira. And it says in Acts 16, she was a seller of purple goods. So she had her own clothing line, probably in town, selling her latest line of clothes, meets the Apostle Paul and helps him plant this church in Philippi. And if she went back to Thyatira, she probably helped plant this church that we're reading about now. And so because of all the manufacturing that was done in the city, what they were most known for, and they weren't known for a lot, is their unions, their trade guilds. Historians tell us that there was these unions for wool workers and linen workers and makers of outer garments and leather workers and dyers and tanners and potters and bakers and bronzesmiths and shoemakers. There's all these groups, these guilds, these unions you would be a part of in those various trades in Thyatira. And if you weren't a member of these unions and you didn't participate in their conferences and conventions that they would do about once a month, you were at financial risk. You couldn't produce and you couldn't work like you would want to if you weren't a part of these unions. That was the tension and the problem for the Christians living there. To participate in these unions, you had to participate in these conferences that they would have, where about once a month they would eat a meal together and they would sacrifice to a god, right? So they would have these different gods. This is the Greco-Roman world, many gods. And so they would sacrifice to whatever god they had attributed to the god of their guild, their trade. And so typically that was the god Apollo in Thyatira. Apollo was the god of sunlight. He was the son of Zeus, so the son of God. That's why Jesus in verse 18 calls himself the son of God. And they would sacrifice to Apollo in hopes that Apollo, if they could appease that god, Apollo would make their business successful. That was a part of their monthly dinner. And then typically, even like work conferences in our day, that night would lead to a party with a lot of drinking and the sexual immorality that goes with that, okay? And so the Christians in Thyatira, they were faced with that tension. Do we participate in this or not? Should we, now that we're a Christian, should we do this or not? They had to ask the question that every generation of the church always has to ask: how do I navigate my faith in the time and place in which I live? How do I live out the ways of Jesus in my cultural moment? That's the question that they're asking. And they're not a terrible church. Jesus says they're doing some good things. In verse 19, he commends them. He says, hey, you're doing some good work. Specifically, you're growing in your works. Right? You love people, you're serving them, you're caring for the city, you're doing some good things. But notice there's no persecution that they're facing from the people in the city. There was nothing that the people of the city thought offensive in the church in Thyatira. They were not offensive enough. The church in Ephesus was too offensive. They were too harsh. They were not loving enough. The church in Thyatira isn't offensive enough. They didn't want to offend people. Some of you really, really don't want to offend people, but you rarely think twice about how that might offend God. And so they don't want to offend anybody, and so they're too nice. They're too nice. And so Jesus says in verse 20, I have this against you. You tolerate that woman Jezebel. I want you to be intolerant of Jezzy. I want you to be intolerant, he says, of Jezebel, who calls herself, verse 20, a prophetess, and is teaching and seducing my servants to, here are the two things she's teaching, to practice sexual immorality and to eat food sacrificed to idols, okay? So we're gonna have to talk about that. So this woman's name is probably not actually Jezebel. Jesus is attributing this name to her because there's an Old Testament gal by the name of Jezebel. If you grew up in a very, very, very charismatic church, like we're charismatic, but I'm talking about like a really charismatic church, you have heard of Jezebel, okay? You know Jezebel, okay? So this is probably not her name. Don't name your daughter Jezebel, okay? Don't name your son Judas. Don't name your daughter Jezebel. Right? If you're pregnant, you're like, oh, honey, we should pick out a Bible name. Don't pick Judas, okay? For your kid, just don't do it. Not all Bible names are equal, okay? So Jezebel, she comes from, this is an Old Testament character in the Bible. She was the wife of King Ahab, one of the terrible kings of Israel, who led God's people astray. She led God's people into the worship of Baal, who is the god of fertility. She built altars to Aphrodite, who is the goddess of sex. She financially supported 850 prophets to go into the nation of Israel and to promo her false teaching. Right? She wanted to go viral, and so she funded all of these prophets to go out and say, here's what we should do. We should worship the God of the Bible, but also Baal and also Aphrodite. And so she encouraged the worship and sacrifice to these gods and the practices of sexual immorality that always go with the worship of other gods. And so Jezebel is the picture in the Old Testament of moral compromise. She is the picture of moral compromise in the Bible, and Jesus is saying her ideas shouldn't be tolerated. So here's the conversation I think we need to try to imagine. Revelation chapter 1, the first vision we have of Jesus is that he stands in the midst of the church, right? He stands in the midst of these churches, and he looks in and he looks at us, and he's looking at the church of Thyatira, and he says, there's some good things that you have, but your faith has been compromised. I'm not big enough. Some other things seem just as important. And so your faith has been compromised. And I think he's going to say two things to this church. I think there's two things that he would say to a church or a Christian whose faith has maybe been compromised. Here's the first thing. First, Jesus is essentially saying, I only function as the center of your life. I only function as the center. This is the picture of the bronze feet. I only function as the center of your life. The bronze feet of Jesus, like this kind of picture. It comes from the Old Testament, the book of Daniel, where Daniel has this vision of all the human kingdoms of ancient history. And all the nations and all the kingdoms and all the rulers of ancient history, they're this statue. And the feet of the statue are a mixture of iron and clay. So they look steady, they look strong, but eventually they fall. They can't bear the weight of their own rule. They're not something to build your life on. And Jesus is saying, no, I have bronzed feet, strong and firm and steady and already tested by fire. All other kingdoms are built on shaky ground, but you build your life on me and it'll last forever. You make me central. You make me the center of your life. I'm not just one aspect of your life, I'm the whole thing. Saying I only function as the center of your life. Because if we have a compartmentalized faith, it's going to lead to a compromised faith. Right? If we keep Jesus just kind of to the side with a bunch of other things, eventually we'll find a way in which we compromise that faith when we want something else. If Jesus is small and he's just part of our life, it leads to compromise. And the cultural moment that we're having to navigate is one of secularism. And secularism wants you to privatize your faith and compartmentalize your faith. Have your faith, just don't go public about it. Keep your faith out of business and politics. Don't let it seep into the rest of your life. Just keep that on Sunday, and that's what we hear. But the whole Bible is saying, no, keep Jesus as the center of your life. Let everything flow from and flow through your love and adoration and trust of Jesus. Every aspect of who you are, right? So here's the difference. Show the next one. A compartmentalized life. It's like a pie, right? And Jesus is just one slice of the pie. You've got your money and your family and your work or your school. You've got your time and your energy. You've got your sexual relationships, and then you've got your Jesus. And he's just kind of one slice of the pie. And you've got other slices, and maybe Jesus is even the biggest one, but it's just one aspect of your life. And Jesus is saying, no, I want you to make me central. I want to be the center of all of that. That everything that you do in life flows through me. Out of worship and adoration and trust in me, will you think about money? Out of worship and adoration and trust in me, will you operate in your family or in your work or your school? You make me center, right? Make me center. This is how this thing works. I only function as the center of your life. I'm the king, and my kingdom will never end. Second thing I think Jesus is saying to a church or Christian, a Christian who has maybe compromised their faith is, make me the center, and then everything else will be given to you. If you make me the center, then everything else will be given to you. One of the questions that I had when I was reading this was in verse 20, where Jesus says, Jezebel is teaching and seducing my servants. I kind of couldn't move past this. My wife knows, I struggled with this sermon literally for 2 weeks because I didn't even have to preach it last week because we called the Audible. And I kind of just got stuck on this and I was just kind of struck with this idea. Why is Jezebel's message so alluring? Why is her message so seductive, and why do preachers and teachers make Jesus' message so boring? I was just kind of angry and frustrated at this whole thing of preaching, and I get it, I get the difficulty of it, but then I just kind of get frustrated at the American church as well sometimes with it. But why are they listening to Jezzy's podcast and liking her Instagram posts and going to her small group? And Jesus' message isn't all that appealing to them. And I just kind of grieved this. I resonate with the Apostle Paul, and I think it's 2 Corinthians 11. He says, I feel a divine jealousy for you. I feel jealous for us that we would see Jesus' message as sweeter and better and more beautiful than Jezzy's. It's why is this? And I think it's because we've failed you. Right? That we've sold Jesus as a spiritual cheerleader to you that helps you with all the other pieces of the pie. That here's your Jesus. He's a spiritual life coach that'll help you with money and help you with work. And that's not totally untrue. He's just way bigger than that. Or maybe we've told you only what he wants you to do or not do. Right? We made him a cosmic policeman, or we've made him a spiritual life coach, but we've not told you about the magisterial beauty and power and glory of God, who, if you lost everything, would be enough. Who's better than anything you might get or receive from the world. We don't tell you why he's better. We don't tell you why he's better. Or Jezzy just does it better, I don't know. It's a fair question. What's the big deal about who we sleep with? And what the heck does it mean to eat food sacrificed to idols? And whatever it means, can I follow Jesus and do those things too? And the answer is no, because Jesus only functions as the center of your life, and those things would rob you of his beauty and glory and power. And he's better. Right? It'd be like somebody saying, I'm married now. I'm married to the most amazing person. I love it. She's so wonderful. But why can't I sleep with other people and still party with my old college friends every night? Well, because those things would rob you of the glory of marriage. Those things would keep you from the joy of that relationship, because your marriage is better than those things. And so let me try to show you why seeking first the king and his kingdom is better than anything that Jezebel has to offer us, and that Jesus, he gives us far more than she can promise. And so first, okay, take these two things she's teaching. First, eating food sacrificed to idols. Okay, you all got to quit that. It's a real problem at the Paradox. Okay, we can move on. No. Whenever you read something about this in the Bible, because this is all over the Bible, okay, literally from the Old Testament to the New Testament to the book of Revelation, the church is always dealing with three things, two of them right here. Ethnic conflict, meat sacrificed to idols, and sexual morality. Those are the three things from the Old Testament to the New Testament to right now that we have to be concerned about. It's always the three issues, okay? Ethnic conflict, meat sacrificed to idols, and sexual immorality. But she's talking about these two, meat sacrificed to idols, and sexual immorality. Whenever you read anything about eating food sacrificed to idols, think worshiping other gods. Think idolatry, because that's what that means. Jezebel was teaching the church in Thyatira that it was no big deal to go to those work conferences and to participate in the worship of those gods and to partner with those unions for financial means. She was saying, don't make Jesus the center of your financial security. Do what you need to do. And what you need to do is participate in these kind of things. That's how play the game. Play the game. Keep your Jesus. But you got to play the game because you want to make some money. And so go do those things. It might be similar to the questions you might have about being a part of a certain fraternity or sorority. Can I take part in this group as a Christian? I talked to a guy who was in sales. And he was just kind of wrestling with, like, in sales, like, he was kind of expected to take clients to strip clubs and to party with them. And that was kind of part of what his job entailed. And if he didn't do that, he was losing money. Maybe he even could lose his job. It's those kinds of questions that they're having to navigate. And it may not seem like a big deal. I mean, just go to Vegas and just don't do what they do. Be a part of the sorority and just don't do what they do, maybe. But at the least, you have to think, how is participating in this forming me? How is being a part of this, like, what is it doing to me? How do I relate to Jesus in this? Is this going to stir my affections for Jesus because he's central in everything? Or is this going to rob me of my affections from Jesus and make me compartmentalize my faith and eventually compromise it? They're having to wrestle with that idea. And so maybe you don't join the club. Maybe you don't join that sorority. Maybe you don't take that job at that company. Yes, maybe you do leave money on the table. Maybe you even leave some friends, because the truth is you're probably going to have to give some things up if Jesus is at the center of your life. But he's worth it. He's worth it. Like, look what he promises in verse 26. Jump down to verse 26. The one who conquers and who keeps my works until the end, to him I will give authority over the nations. What? The promise is I will give authority over the nations. Like, what do we even do with that? So in Revelation 19, can't wait for this chapter. Revelation 19, there's this vision of Jesus. He's coming on a white horse. He's got a tattoo on his thigh that says King of Kings and Lord of Lords. That's pretty awesome. He's got a sword coming out of his mouth, and it says that he's going to strike down the nations with a rod of iron. This is a messianic prophecy from Psalm 2. Jesus is going to be this one that rules over the nations, but Jesus here in Revelation 2 attributes it to us. He says, no, the church, to the one who conquers, we are going to be the ones who rule with him over the nations. And this isn't hyperbolic. I need to kind of show you, Genesis to Revelation real quick, how true this is in the Bible all throughout, so you really feel the weight of this promise. This is an unbelievable promise, right? The idea of God's people having authority over everything is all throughout the story of the Bible. In Genesis 1, God makes Adam and Eve, and he makes them as co-rulers over everything. In Genesis 2, he says, hey, I want you to multiply, I want you to fill the earth, and I want you to what? Subdue it. Right, have authority over it. They sin, so that doesn't go very well. Jesus comes and he says, actually, hey, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit what? The whole earth, right, the whole earth. Yeah, you're gonna get it all. And then, like the Apostle Paul, he'll say some crazy things to a crazy church. The church in Corinth was bananas, okay? And he'll say, like 1 Corinthians 3, he says, hey, all things are yours because you are his. All things are yours. And then in 1 Corinthians 6, they were like suing each other, okay? So you're like, man, the church in America is really bad. We are not the church in Corinth, okay? They're suing each other, and Paul's like, man, can't you deal with this in-house? Like, and then he says, don't you know we're going to judge the angels? We get to stand, I just think like bad angels, demons, sometime in the eternity future, the church gets to stand up and be like, yeah, you were terrible, you're out. And I did not like what you did at all. And you're going to hell. And like, we get to send demons to hell, I don't know. But we have authority over everything. We get to rule with Jesus over everything. Jesus is saying, you're worried about giving up some money and some work and some partnerships and some relationships and some power and some influence, and you're willing to compromise your faith for a few bucks? I'm giving you the whole world. I have all authority in heaven and on earth, and I've redeemed you as my bride to sit on the throne with me. I made you to be a conqueror, and you're compromising for a few bucks or a few friends. I've given you everything. My promise, stick with me. My promise is that you get it all. What Jesus offers is just so much better. And then take sexual immorality. I'll spend more time here for obvious reasons. Here's one reason why Jesus cares about your sex life, and there are many, okay? So here's one reason why Jesus cares about your sex life and why sexual immorality just shows up over and over and over and over and over in the Bible, okay? It has to do with how first century Roman kingdom folk thought about the body and how that is relevant and relates to how we think about the body in our context as well. The Greco-Roman world largely had a Gnostic view of the body, meaning they thought the spiritual kind of reality and realm was higher and more important than the physical. That the physical didn't matter, the spiritual alone matters. Okay, that's the way in which they thought about it. So it didn't really matter what you did in your body. Our bodies don't really matter. They don't really tell us much about things. We can kind of do whatever we want in them or tell our bodies what they are and all that kind of stuff. But the Bible teaches something different, that the Bible teaches that we're holistic beings, that we are made in God's image, and that gives us dignity, value, and worth and significance, all of us, okay? All of us. We are given that dignity and worth because God has stamped his image on us. And he stamped his image on both our personhood and our body, that those things are integrated. The Greek word for body that the Bible uses is the Greek word soma. And it refers to your body and your personhood. Daryl Johnson says this: human beings do not have a soma, a body. We are a soma. I do not have a body, I am a body. My body is not a house or a prison for my real self. My body is my real self. What I do to my body, I do to me. My body may be my outer self, and my soul may be my inner self, but both are the same self. Okay, so follow me here. Every sex act then involves the soma. Every sex act involves the soma, the very essence of who you are. It's not just biology, it's psychology. And we need to have a biblical anthropology to get the most out of how God designed sex to be. We have to have a proper understanding of the body and our person integrated together for us to properly understand sex and what God is doing in it. This is how God has designed it. And by the way, let's not forget, Jezebel didn't come up with this. God did. Or this was God's idea. Sex was God's idea. Pleasure centers and nerve endings and the intimacy and all of that was God's idea. The same God who says, hey, don't pursue sexual immorality, also says in the book, the Song of Solomon, eat, friends, and drink and be drunk with love. This is God's idea. But even science tells us that sex is more than just a physical act. Dr. Brizendine, in the book, The Female Brain, fellas, dudes, read The Female Brain. Not like try to read hers. Read the book and learn, okay? You're welcome. Here's what she says. During times of physical separation, when touching and caressing is impossible, a deep longing, almost a hunger for the beloved can set in. Some people don't even realize how bonded or in love they are until they feel this tugging at their heartstrings when the beloved is absent. We are used to thinking of this longing as only psychological, but it's actually physical. The brain is virtually in a drug withdrawal state. Once reunion takes place, all the components of the original loving bond can be reestablished by dopamine and oxytocin. Activities such as caressing, kissing, gazing, hugging, and orgasm can replenish the chemical bond of love and trust in the brain. The oxytocin dopamine rush once again suppresses anxiety and skepticism and reinforces the love circuits in the brain. What she's saying is literally every sex act is a uniting act. And once you get over the fact that I just read some of that in church, okay, take a deep breath. Listen, sex is you become a part of me and I become a part of you. I'm giving my whole self to you and you give your whole self to me and we become one. That is a mighty human event. Have you ever had a friend where like she's dating someone and you're like, why is she dating him? Right? Or he's dating her and you're like, she is just not right for him. And like your whole group of friends is like over here talking and gossiping and it's like, why is she with him? I don't know. We told you, why is he with her? I don't know. 99 out of 100 times, here's why. They're sleeping together. There's a uniting of the physical and emotional and physiological and relational and spiritual, the whole self, and to pull that apart is painful. And it makes you kind of dumb sometimes. And so there's a bond that has happened that doesn't make sense to you from the outside, but makes complete sense to them because it's really hard to let that go. The Hebrew word for erotic love is dode. It means a mingling of souls. That literally our souls are united. And so sex then, follow me, is physical, mental, emotional, relational, and spiritual. And so when the Bible makes a big deal about sexual immorality, it's trying to show us how to have a higher view of ourselves. A higher view of ourselves. That God is not trying to rob you of something, he's actually trying to give you something. So the Apostle Paul, he dealt with this in the church with Corinth. They had a crazy sexualized culture going on there. One guy sleeping with his stepmom. They think that just like the stomach is made for food, the body was made for sex. It should be no big deal, Paul. Here's what he says in 1 Corinthians 6. He says, run, right? Flee from sexual morality. All right, Paul, what's the big deal? I mean, come on, God's made though, what's the big deal, Paul? Because every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own soma. Sex is one of the most powerful things in the world. There's no such thing as safe sex. We're talking about the only thing that can create life. It is a powerful human event. We're not talking about, brushing our teeth or going to the bathroom or other things that are typically kept private in the home, but in the end are just a physical response to something. We're talking about not merely a biological function, but a powerful human event where you unite in every which way with someone else. And so for sex to happen outside of the way in which God designed, for sex to happen outside at all in any sort of way of the marriage between one man and one woman, just to be crystal clear with you, for that to happen, that is a sin against yourself. You are having a too low view of yourself. And I think that our stories would actually corroborate that as true. Most likely there are few things in your life that have been more emotionally shattering than sexual brokenness and your sexual experiences. And Jesus is saying, I offer something better. I promise you something better than even that. Jesus, he offers a promise to those who fight sexual sin, who can conquer. Verse 28, he says, I will give you the morning star. I don't know if I should admit this, but I will. In high school, I had a girlfriend, and for a gift, I named a star after her. Anybody else? Okay. Sorry, baby, you're my star now. You're my forever star. What kind of business plan was that, right? Like billions of stars. There's no way they have the authority to actually name one of them. Like that's a pretty good business plan. And Jesus is saying, I'm gonna do that too, but this is more legit, this is better. I'm not gonna name a star after you, I'm giving you one. I'm gonna give you the morning star. At the end of Revelation, literally the last thing that Jesus says in the Bible, you know what it is? I am the bright morning star. The morning star comes out around 2 or 3 at night when the darkness is complete and the faintest sign of morning is not yet visible. And Jesus says, that's me. And there's a few things that the bright morning star means, the symbolism of it. It shows up 3 or 4 times in the Bible. But here's one of them. This is by an economist from the Netherlands. I love this quote though. He says, when you see the morning star, you know the night has been defeated. For the morning star pulls the morning in behind it, just as certainly as Jesus pulls the kingdom in behind him. Right? You know that the night has been defeated. The morning star is a symbol of hope. It's a symbol of hope, but it's even greater here as Jesus is using it because Jesus says, I'm gonna give you the morning star. Jesus says, I'm the morning star and I will give you the morning star. This is the promise. He's promising you relationship and intimacy and friendship with the God of the universe. His promise to you is you want intimacy, you wanna be known, you wanna experience deep relationship. I'll give you myself. I give you my friendship. I give you intimacy. Jesus says, make me central in your life and everything that you're really after will be found in me. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. Listen to me. You were not made for eating with fake gods and sleeping with fake lovers. You were made for God. You were made for real friendship and intimacy with the God of the universe. And you were made to rule. Jesus died and rose again to give you new life and to set you free from sin. You are not made to be ruled by your sin. You are no longer a slave to sin. You are no longer a slave to your fear of man, to your pursuit of money or sex. Jesus has greater promises for you. Jesus is huge. Don't make him small. And he only functions as the center of your life. You can't push him to the side. He'll keep coming to the center. And that will be painful, and it will be a gracious pain, a severe mercy. He only functions as king, and his kingdom will never end. And yet, he has so much grace for you. Like, notice, even in verse 21, he graciously waits for Jezebel to repent too. Like Jezebel, in all of her leading astray and false teaching and all that, and this is all spiritual language, right? I'll strike her children dead. That's next week. He's saying, I don't want you to be spiritually dead, but I have grace for you. But I have so much grace for you. And this is a gracious warning that what I have for you is so much better than what you're pursuing. Will you listen? We have ears to hear. Will you make me central? And all these things will be added unto you. Let's pray. I want to give us a moment to respond personally. If you're new, typically we just kind of take a moment here before corporately we sing some more, the promises of God, and we eat at his table, bread and wine. And we pray for you in the back, and we minister to each other. If the Spirit of God is just speaking to your hearts, I just want to give you a moment to respond to that. This is an invitation. I was praying and just trying to ask the Lord to, just what is he saying? What is he doing? I wonder if your response to sexual sin, to your sexual experiences has just been shame. Shame is not freedom. Shame does not know the grace of God. Shame is not what Jesus is after. And I think the other side is probably like just maybe an ignoring or just trying to kind of not believe what Jesus has clearly spoken of in the scriptures in regards to your sexual relationships. But I actually think, at least right now, or at least in this service, I don't know, I just think shame is the weightier thing maybe. And so if that's you, would you just, I don't know, would you be encouraged to just hear from the Lord right now? Remember Jesus, he's standing in the midst of the church after his crucifixion, after his resurrection, after he has dealt with your sin. Jesus is done dealing with your sin. There's nothing else to pay. There's nothing else to do. You owe no payment. And so the invitation is to walk in freedom from what he's already purchased. but there is no shame. This is a moment where he's inviting you to repent. It's his kindness that leads us to repentance, Romans 2 says. It's this wooing invitation. Come to me, all who are weary, all who are heavy, and I will give you rest. And so, when you're ready, you can come eat with us. If you're a Christian, come take from the table. We get to eat with the one true God, the living God, who doesn't ask us to make sacrifices for him. He made a sacrifice for us. The prayer team will be in the back. We want to pray for you. Let's minister and encourage to one another. Love you all.